Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to r/EntitledPeople, where people truly believe they're the center of the universe and nobody else matters. And in today's episode, it's all about Karens causing trouble in airports and on planes, guys. And the stories are absolutely wild. I hope you enjoy them, don't shake your heads too hard, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. Okay. So let me tell you about the time a person flying next to me kept violating my personal space. I was flying in the window seat because I like looking out the window. The woman sitting next to me just reached in front of me multiple times to close the window shade. She never asked me, just reached directly in front of me to close the shade. I would immediately reopen it, and a few minutes later, she would reach in front of me to close it again. This happened twice, and on the third time she did it, she aggressively said to me, "I like to have that down while flying. Thank you." It was noon, a domestic short-haul flight, so no reason to need darkness in the middle of the day, and absolutely no excuse for violating my personal space multiple times without asking me, or acknowledging me, or treating me like a human in any way. So I pulled out my book, and I turned on the reading light, despite there being ample natural light from the open window for me to read. I then positioned my hands in such a way that my watch would reflect the reading light directly into her eyes. I read like that for an hour, jiggling my hand the entire time, so it would shine the light back and forth across her eyes and be super distracting and annoying. Once we landed, she took her headphones off, and I turned to her and said, "Next time you fly, book a window seat if you want to control the window. Or at least treat me like a human and ask before you violate my personal space. What you did is unbelievably rude." Hearing that, she looked so offended that she literally just scoffed at me without saying a word. She then tried to be petty and tried to block me with her slow walking off the plane, which was blatantly obvious. I easily got in front of her, and then once we were on the moving walkway, I stopped immediately in front of her, causing her to bump into my backpack and drop her phone. I did the same thing on the escalator to the curb, before flipping her off the entire way to my ride. Some people. Yeah, I think we can all agree that whoever sits in the window seat gets control of the window shade, right? And honestly, if it bugs somebody in the row, they can always speak up and be polite about it. Like what that woman did was so entitled, like reaching over someone's body not once, but multiple times to close the shade, and then having the audacity to say, "This is how I like it when I fly, so deal with it," is absolutely absurd. And OP using their watch and reflecting the light into Karen's eyes the whole flight was brilliant. Guys, let me know what you would do if you're in OP's shoes. Who's keeping that shade open the whole damn flight? I know I would be. So back when I used to work at an airport, I often dealt with kids traveling without parents. This was a paid service called unaccompanied minors, available to anyone under 18, but mandatory to kids under the age of 12 who traveled alone. The rule is that the parent or guardian or whoever escorts the kids has to stay at the airport until the plane's in the air. This was in case the flight was canceled because the paid service did not cover anyone staying with the kid until the next flight. The most extreme case would be, obviously, that there would be no flight available that day anymore, in which the kid would have to go home and come back the next day. Now, obviously, most parents were fine with going to the gate with their kids and staying until the very last minute. And in all my years, I've only had trouble with one entitled dad, the Karen of our story. The guy came up to the business counter with his kid, which was already a big no-no, as checking in unsupervised kids takes longer than average, and the business counter was supposed to be a fast lane for business class and high-tier passengers. The dad goes to show his own gold card, so I bit back my annoyance and asked the person next to me to check in my queue until I was done. I gave dad all the forms he had to fill, which annoyed him. The kid was obviously under 10 and seemed very sweet. She did look a bit nervous, and I guess she had never done this before, as over the years, you learn to spot the ones who weren't accustomed to traveling alone. I asked her where she was going in hopes to calm her nerves, and she said to see Pop and Grandma. The dad then gave me back the forms, and then he asked, "So where do I leave her?" Hearing that, I got a bit confused, but I told him, like always, that he had to stay at the airport until the plane was in the air. Hearing that, he loses it and says, "What? No, I paid for her to be accompanied, so you will get somebody to accompany her." I just respond, well, yeah, but that's from the gate to the plane and from the plane to arrivals. He then says, I have a meeting in a town 3 hours away. I can't stay with her. I just tell him, sir, what if the flight's canceled? We'd have to call you back. He then says to me, then she would stay here with you, wouldn't she? I tell him, that's not a possibility, sir. You agree to the terms when you pay. You have to stay here until she boards her flight. Now the guy didn't like this, and he shouts at me saying, I didn't pay for this, her mother did, and she told me I could just leave the kid with you. Well, at this point, the kid starts crying, saying, Daddy, please come with me, I'm scared. The guy then says to his daughter, don't you start. You like flying, don't you? And before she could say a word, he says, I don't care, I don't have the time to come with you today to your gate. He then turns to me and says, I want to speak to your manager, you're not doing your job right. So while we waited for my supervisor, we hear an announcement through the loudspeakers about a car parking in the no parking zone. The dad then literally went, crap, and he ran away, leaving his daughter at my counter. Of course, she starts crying, and I panicked that the dad was taking this opportunity to bail. My supervisor came and we closed my counter completely, and then took the kid aside to talk over our options, hoping the dad would come back. So after 5 minutes and no dad, we tried calling him with the phone number provided. No answer. We then tried calling the mom, whose contact info was also on the papers. We got a hold of her, and she said she'd call Dad, and asked if there was any way that we could take the kid to the gate if he didn't appear, if she promised she'd be there in about 30 minutes. We told her there was still plenty of time before the flight left, but we wouldn't let the kid go to the gate without a parent. The mother was understanding, and she told us that either she or the dad would be there soon. Well, a few minutes later, the dad comes back, arguing over the phone with who we assumed was the mom. He then yanks the daughter by her arm, and he took her through security. We did feel bad, and we thought that was that, but no. I went back to my counter to finish the check-in, and then I got a call from the gate telling me that the dad left the kid with them. Obviously, there's a lot to do before a flight leaves, so they can't really look after her, and they asked if I could try to see him and tell him to come back. I didn't manage to spot him, so my supervisor told me to go sit with the kid, while she again called the mom. My shift was about to end, and I didn't have to hurry anywhere except home, so I agreed to work a little overtime. The kid was in tears, crying hysterically because dad left her, and my shift manager had to get involved, while my supervisor called the mom. The shift manager then calls the airline, asking if we can allow the kid on the flight if there is no parent present when the flight leaves. They told us straight up no. Fortunately, I get a call from my supervisor telling me that mom had arrived. To make things easier at security, me and the kid went back to check-in, and the mom signed new forms and she escorted the kid through security again. The kid made the flight fine and it left on time. The mom was so embarrassed about the whole incident. She did say that this was the first and last time that dad would ever escort the kid, and she thanked us for doing all we could. She was obviously upset and overwhelmed, so it was not surprising that she just left after the thank you. I had to stay a while longer to write an incident report, and I got home absolutely exhausted. Honestly, reading this post, guys, I was actually so upset. Like, just thinking about how terrified the girl must have been and begging dad to take her to the gate, which he then abandoned her at, is freaking heartbreaking. Like, what dad did, in my opinion, was so sucky. Like, your kid's crying, terrified that she's being left alone with complete strangers. So why not stay the extra few moments to make sure she's okay? But who knows, maybe the dad had a plan. Maybe in his head, he was like, let's just muck this up so badly that my wife will never ask me to do this again. Guys, let me know your thoughts. So this one is a long one, but it's the best story of my life so far. I'm a South African living in Japan, and I took my Japanese wife to meet my parents and have a honeymoon in South Africa. On the first of 3 flights back to Japan, we're heading to Qatar. We take our seats and get settled in. As soon as we got settled in, I noticed that the woman and 2 men who sat behind us were employees of this pharmaceutical company, as they were wearing similar shirts. I only noticed as she, let's call her Brandy, was quite chatty. She was loud and obnoxious. But I'm a nervous flyer, so at the time, I was more worried about the takeoff than her. So I put my earbuds on and whoosh, we take off for the 8-hour flight. As soon as the seatbelt sign switched off, Brandy starts ordering brandy and cokes for herself and her 2 coworkers. As each drink came, Brandy's voice got louder and more obnoxious. After drink number 6, the topic of her conversation turns to relationships, and by this time, half the cabin could hear their conversation about how she disapproves of interracial relationships. And then it happened. A nice woman sitting on 4 seats to her left quite loudly says, "Ma'am, could you please quiet down? You're a bit loud and I'm trying to get some sleep." Now I heard this too, so I paused the song that was playing and I took out my left earpod to excitedly eavesdrop. Brandy was not happy. She says, "Excuse me, but the last time I checked, this isn't a nighttime flight. Use earplugs." She then jumps straight back into her conversation, and this is when the tension in the air immediately changed. In that moment, all the people who heard the interaction caught eyes with each other, and we all knew this flight was about to get interesting. A flight attendant, of course, immediately comes over and politely asks Brandy to quiet down a bit. She begrudgingly agrees, but it only takes Brandy 30 minutes to get all the way back up to a volume louder than the jet engines roaring outside the windows. And this is when another woman, a few rows behind Brandy, gets up and walks to where she's sitting. And in her best attempt at English, she says, "Please be quiet. My child keeps waking because of you." And this is when Brandy looks up at her, and I kid you not, she asks the Chinese woman to speak better English, and that she doesn't understand what she's saying. She just kept repeating it until the frustrated Chinese woman just went back to her seat. By this time, both flight attendants in our cabin were very much aware of Brandy's sassy nature, and they decided to close the bar for the whole cabin, which did piss me off because I was hoping to enjoy a few more whiskeys before we landed. Well, a few minutes later, I hear the sound of shuffling, and then plastic, and then the faint sound of what sounds like the cap of a glass bottle being cracked open. Yep, Brandy had opened her bottle of duty-free brandy she bought at the airport, and once again, their conversation begins to crescendo. Now, the whole time, I had been spectating the Brandy situation. I wasn't really paying attention to my wife, who I assumed was sleeping next to me. I then saw my wife pull out one of her earbuds to try to turn around to look at Brandy through the crack in the seat, and then she turns to me with a face that I rarely see my wife make. It was a face of pure rage and frustration, and I snapped. Now, usually, I'm not the kind of person who likes to cause a scene, but I decided that I'm not gonna let this a-hole of a woman ruin everyone's flight. So like a crazy person, I stand up and I announce loud enough that the entire cabin turned to hear me. I said, "Excuse me, everybody. Can I please have all of your attention? By a show of hands, who would like these people to shut the F up?" About 30 passengers around us raised their hands. And this is when I turn to Brandy and I point and say, "Look, you see that? Understand? Now shut up." I then sat back down, and my wife was shocked I did that. But I told her that I did it because I could see Brandy annoying everyone, and someone had to speak up. The flight attendant that saw what I did brought me my cup of Coke, and she slipped me 2 of those little bottles of whiskey as a kind of a thank you. Thankfully, Brandy and the gang then passed out, and they were quiet for the rest of the flight, so my wife and I did relax. But Brandy wasn't finished. She now had a new target, which was me. On our descent, Brandy awakes, and she decides that she wants to play some cards on the entertainment screen attached to the back of my seat. She was trying her best to hit the buttons hard enough to make my seat move. Now, I teach kids for a living, so I know she's behaving like an angry toddler, trying to get a rise out of me, so I just ignore her. We land, and the plane taxis off the runway, and everyone starts getting up to get off the plane. As soon as I get up, she sees my wife and I, and she starts repeatedly insulting me about my weight, and how I married an Asian woman because I can't get a real South African woman, blah blah blah. Just high school level BS. I just smile and nod my head at everything she was saying, and then exit the plane. Finally, Brandy and her coworkers walk off, and my wife and I find a nice cafe to have a coffee and chill at for a bit before we make our way to the next boarding gate for our second flight to Malaysia. We eventually get to the gate, and lo and behold, guess who's also flying to Malaysia? That's right, Brandy. She's standing by the gate window, taking selfies, and she doesn't notice me. I find an empty seat next to a guy wearing the same pharmaceutical company t-shirt, who wasn't directly behind us. And I say, "Excuse me, sir, that woman over there with blonde hair taking a selfie, what's her name?" He asked me why, and I say that she looks like someone I used to go to school with, but I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to make an ass of myself by asking her directly. So he tells me, and I say, "Oh, it's not her, I'm sorry." I thank him, and for the remainder of the wait at the gate, I then got on my phone, found their company's Facebook page and website, and I then sent a detailed recount of Brandy's behavior, being sure to include all the colorful things she was talking about with her coworkers. The next 2 flights back to Japan were uneventful, and we got home safe and sound. 2 weeks later, I get a reply from someone who I think was her boss, asking me for my contact information as he would like to talk to me about what happened. He calls me and he profusely apologizes for what Brandy put us through. It turns out that by the time Brandy landed in Malaysia, he had seen my message and he fired her when she got back. I bought a bottle of brandy and Coke on my way home from work that day to celebrate with my lovely wife. What a story that was, guys, and the cherry on top was that Karen got fired. Like, she must have already been a bad employee or something, because to get fired over a random person writing a detailed message on a Facebook page without concrete proof of the situation, that is a little much. And this is why you have to be on your best behavior all the time, because you never know who's going to go the extra mile to ruin you for saying outlandish things and being obnoxious. Hopefully Karen learned her lesson. So this happened to my cousin 2 months ago during his flight. Since my cousin's tall, he always books an exit row aisle seat well in advance, and he even pays extra for it. So fast forward to the day of the flight. My cousin boards, finds his row, and he sees someone sitting right in his seat. The entire row's filled, but there's clearly a seat snatcher situation. Undeterred, he approaches the woman in his seat, who we'll call Karen. My cousin says to her, "Excuse me, I believe that's my seat." Karen, barely glancing up, says, No, there is no way. I always book the aisle seat." My cousin tells her, "Maybe you're just in the wrong row. Would you mind checking?" At this, Karen sighs dramatically, and she says, "Look, this is my seat. Maybe you're mistaken." My cousin then firmly says, "Well, my ticket says this is my seat. Let's check with the flight attendant, shall we?" My cousin then heads to the front of the plane, and he explains the situation to the flight attendant. She then confirms that the seat's indeed his, but instead of escalating, my cousin decides to play it cool. He returns to Karen with a new idea. My cousin says to Karen, "I just spoke to the attendant. She confirmed that this is my seat. But since you seem certain, she's offered me a complimentary upgrade to business class." Hearing business class, Karen seems interested, and she says, "Business class? Really?" My cousin says, "Yeah, but although honestly I prefer the leg room in the exit row. Would you want to switch and take the upgrade?" Hearing that, Karen grins and says, "Oh, absolutely." My cousin says, "Great, so just go up to the front and let the attendant know that you're taking the business class upgrade, meant for passenger in 13C. She'll get you all set." At that, Karen hops up immediately. She grabs her bag and struts to the front. My cousin finally takes his rightful seat, and he chats with the other passengers, and they reveal that they've been irritated by Karen's antics too. He shows them his boarding pass, confirming that he's exactly where he's supposed to be. And here's the twist. This particular flight didn't even have business class seats. My cousin knew that, so when Karen confidently asked the flight attendant for her upgrade, the attendant looks at her in total confusion. Realizing something's off, Karen storms back irritated and she confronts my cousin. She says, "Excuse me, you said there was an upgrade to business class." At that, my cousin innocently responds saying, "Did I?" Karen says, "Obviously, you told me to go up there and ask for a business class seat. There are no business class seats." My cousin says to her, "Why would I do that?" At this point, Karen's huffing and she's losing it. She says, "Because I was sitting in your seat and you said..." It's at this point my cousin interrupts her and says, "Okay, so why were you in my seat? I clearly have 13C on my boarding pass, so why were you in my seat?" Karen's all flustered now and she's trying to explain herself, but a fellow passenger jumps in and says, "He's not lying, that's his seat, I saw his ticket." The flight attendant, now visibly exasperated, politely asks Karen to show her boarding pass. Karen rolls her eyes dramatically, muttering under her breath about the incompetence of the airline staff. She then makes a big show of digging through her purse and then her carry-on and even her coat pocket, all the while huffing and sighing loudly as if everybody around her was wasting her precious time. Well, after a few minutes of this performance, she finds her boarding pass, but she clutches it tightly, refusing to hand it over. She then spins around to face my cousin, looking livid, and she says, "This is all your fault. First, you try to steal my seat, and now you're embarrassing me in front of the entire plane." The flight attendant says, "Ma'am, just show us your boarding pass so we can sort this out." Karen, ignoring the attendant, says, "Do you know how much I fly? How often I choose the aisle seats because I need them?" She then gestures around wildly and says, "But today, I have to deal with some random guy who thinks he can barge in and claim my seat." Karen's voice is growing louder, and passengers around her are beginning to shift uncomfortably. By now, Karen's frustration has transformed into a full-blown rant, complete with finger-pointing and accusations. She goes after everyone: the airline for hiring useless staff, the attendant for not knowing anything, and my cousin, who she calls a liar and a cheat. The flight attendant attempts to calm her down, reminding her that they're causing a delay. But Karen's relentless. Her voice is escalating with every second that passes. She accuses the airline of disrespecting loyal passengers, and she shouts that she'll file a complaint so big that they'll lose their jobs. By now, nearly 20 minutes have gone by, and passengers around her are beginning to sigh and check their watches. Eventually, the captain's informed of the situation, and he comes over to assess the problem. The captain very firmly tells Karen, "Ma'am, we need you to show your boarding pass right now, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." At that, Karen's shocked. Her face flushes as she realizes that her show isn't working. She finally hands over the boarding pass to the captain, who takes one glance at it and then looks right back at her with a raised eyebrow. He then says out loud, "Ma'am, this says 22B. Your seat is 9 rows back, and it's a middle seat." There is a stunned silence as Karen's face goes pale. She then tries one last-ditch excuse, saying, "This is just so unfair. I'm under a lot of stress, and I can't just sit in the middle seat for this long flight. I need an upgrade for this horrible experience." The captain just tells her, "Ma'am, you either go to your assigned seat or you will need to deboard." Defeated, Karen finally gathers her things, her face burning red with embarrassment as she walks down the aisle to her actual seat in 22B. Along the way, she keeps muttering curses under her breath, and she's shooting daggers at my cousin and the flight crew. Meanwhile, my cousin settles back into his rightful seat, and the flight finally prepares for takeoff. What a mess that was, guys, and really, if Karen was that gullible to believe that there was a business class, despite getting on the plane and probably not seeing the business class seats, she deserves what happened. Like, it just boggles my mind so much that people resort to stealing other people's seats when they don't like theirs, and then have the audacity to play victim. Meanwhile, we all know the true victims here are the people who sit in 22A and 22C. I hope they had headphones, because you know for a fact that Karen's not shutting up the whole flight. So on my last flight, I had the unfortunate luck of sitting next to an entitled mom and her unruly child. I was cursing myself because I've had terrible experiences with kids in my aisles on flights, so I was already not in a great mood. The flight started out pretty smooth though, but things quickly took a turn. This kid, who must have been around 5 or 6, was running up and down the aisle, throwing toys and making a mess. The flight attendants were doing their best to manage, but the mom was just sitting there, scrolling through her phone like nothing was happening. About halfway through the flight, I order a Coke. As soon as it arrived and I took a sip, the kid zeroed in on it. He starts whining and pointing at my drink, making a scene. And before I knew it, the mom was giving me these dirty looks, like I was some kind of demon for not sharing my Coke with her prince. She then leans over, and in a tone that dripped with arrogance, she said, "He really wants your drink. Just give it to him." At that, I was stunned. I mean, it's free, so just ask the flight attendant to get one for yourself. When I declined and suggested that she get the flight attendant for another one, she just huffed and rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath. Now, I'm a petty guy, so I took my sweet time in having the drink while loudly playing music on my headphones. Despite her, I actually ordered another Coke. But this time, the kid tried swiping the drink from the attendant's hand. The attendant scolded the mom in a quiet and stern tone to bring her kid under control, after which the mom huffed and puffed like an out-of-shape marathon runner. For the rest of the flight, she kept glaring at me like I snitched on her to the principal, while her kid continued causing problems. It's absolutely amazing how some parents think the world revolves around them and their poorly behaved kids. Why have kids when you can't be asked to parent them properly? Some people's self-entitlement never ceases to amaze me. Like, even with things that are free, they will somehow still demand it from strangers. Like, is not asking for a stranger's drink totally outrageous, guys? Because it is. Like, who knows what OP could have had? He could have been sick. He could have had some sort of weird mouth disease. Whatever, right? Like, for a parent to see a stranger sip on something and still have the nerve to demand it for their kid is absolutely wild. Like, why? But yeah, entitled people, right? And that, my friends, brings us to another end of our / entitled people. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed yesterday's episode on the channel, it's in our / malicious compliance episode, where teachers are going against students and they're losing big time. Guys, go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.